Good afternoon. I'm Melissa Murray. I'm the Stokes Professor of Law here at NYU Law, and I'm also the Faculty Director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Center. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this keynote conversation with Alexis McGill-Johnson, the CEO of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Let me say a little bit about you, Alexis. As we all know, Planned Parenthood is a national nonprofit organization that is the United States' most trusted name in sexual and reproductive health and rights. Through a network of separately incorporated affiliates, Planned Parenthood health centers provide vital health care to nearly 2 million people each year at nearly 600 health centers around the country. And this allows everyone, no matter who they are, where they live, or what their socioeconomic circumstances, to access supportive, high-quality health care and live full and healthy lives. In addition to all of this, Alexis is also the president and CEO of the Planned Parenthood Action Fund, which is a national reproductive health and rights advocacy organization. So you are the leader of all things. But before we get into the actual subject matter of this symposium, I want to talk a little bit about the political climate.
Okay, I will do so wearing my Action Fund hat.
Good. You're exactly not your.
I am trained. I've got a little general counsel who sits on my shoulder.
Yes.
And yes, exactly.
I don't have that, which is often a problem.
I can imagine.
Yeah, often a problem. Often a problem. So the last time we were together, it was over the summer where we were at a friend's house and we were watching Joe Biden's interview with George Stephanopoulos. And this was after the ill-fated debate with Donald Trump, at which everyone is like, oh no, we're going to lose the election. And then we were watching this, it was supposed to be, I think, a recuperative interview. It turned out not to be terribly recuperative. And I think we came upstairs and you and I looked at each other and said, we might be going to jail. Right?
I actually think when you looked across the table at me while we were eating our ice cream to we probably pulled all the pints out of the refrigerator.
Every single pint.
Every single one. And you said, you're going to jail.
And then you said, you'll be my cellmate. So.
Exactly.
True. Let's talk about where we are, right? We have seen just over the course of a week things that I never imagined I would see in this country in my lifetime. So how do you, as someone who occupies this space at the intersection of medicine, law, and politics, how do you view this landscape?
I mean, it's absolutely horrifying, right? We're in day 52, 53, 54 or something.
Of a 4-year sentence.
Of a 4-year sentence, yes. And I am reminded, abortion and democracy were the cornerstone messages, really, of the last 2 federal elections. And, people argued against democracy, being something that would connect to people or energize people. We also, saw obviously a lot of fights state by state to codify abortion rights protections. But we kept saying, this abortion fight is a democracy fight, right? Actually, an abortion could save our democracy if we really understood the impact. And, to watch autocracy, to watch fascism set in through these sets of orders, through these engagements, whether it is denying, due process to a student protesting, whether it is attempts to strip access to basic healthcare insurance through Medicaid, the ways in which they are trying to both undermine the populace and undermine the rule of law at the same time. And, I think I see this moment, and I want to shout out April Jones-Beck. Can you raise your hand, please? She is the Planned Parenthood CEO of Delaware. And I shout her out because, literally, she's on the front lines of tyranny. Every day, patients are showing up from all across the South to coming into Delaware, traveling up 95, flying in, to get appointments because they are living in states where the majority of the state actually supports access to abortion care, and they are denied access there. So it's like the fundamental erosion of democracy and of just popular will through gerrymandering and local tyranny, and then how that escalates. And then now you have an administration that is just willing to throw the actual rule of law and constitution under the bus in order to, continue to consolidate control and power. And that is terrifying.
So you frequently have to work with lawmakers, including Democratic lawmakers. What do you make of the effort to oppose this administration in this moment? I have to say, I read the paper this morning, and the only thing I could think of was, "What the fuck, Chuck?"
What the fuck, Chuck? I same. I mean, on Wednesday I was at a rally with a bunch of lawmakers and advocates around protecting Medicaid. One of the things that's most important to understand about Planned Parenthood is 50% of our patients are Medicaid patients. So a defund of Medicaid will be a defund of access to basic quality, STI testings and, wellness exams and birth control and so forth, undermining just the very fabric of our structure. And to see the, not just a what the fuck, Chuck, of like, what are you doing in this moment, but actually whipping and bringing Democrats, along to the process when you see the majority of the party and the majority of people standing complete in contrast to that. I do not think that the signs were, the signs.
I believe they were independent school silent auction paddles.
Oh. No lies, no cap. I think that the world needs resistance, like actual resistance to tyranny. We cannot be complicit in that process. And so I do think that, we don't have an elected body that is represented where the electorate is right now. The contrast to that, I will say, is that everywhere I've been, just a little bit this week, right? I was saying, I don't know if it's like the extra daylight savings, the spring energy, but there is kind of, I think a lot of people are coming up out of their hole, their Groundhog's Day hole, and into being like, oh my God, what is happening? And I have been in multiple spaces this week that actually have been about organized. They've all been actually powered by women. They've all been powered largely by women of color. And they've all been driving kind of the real, both how are we going to meet the need conversations and how are we going to fight back conversations. So like, even though I don't think our electeds are kind of in the same place as where the populace is, which tends to be the case quite often, we are in a moment now where we have to spine up their spines.
How do we do that?
I mean, it will be the next week is a in-district week all across the country. People will be holding town halls. I do think this is one valuable thing that the Democratic National Committee is going to do, hosting town halls in Republican districts, because they are taking them down. But the people still need a space to engage in conversations, and they got a little taste and preview of what that actually looks like, and what happens when you cut veterans, benefits, and what happens when you start to take Medicaid away, and all of these things. And so we are going to ensure that those conversations happen. But if people don't understand the consequences as we move forward over the next 2 years, where their next target is going to be obviously to hold the House so they can finish enacting whatever policies they want to colonize Mars on. I don't know what the actual agenda is, but they know that they will need to hold the Congress for the next 2 years, and that's going to be the beginning of the breaking point.
Right, so that is encouraging. So there are going to be town halls all over the country. We need to start organizing people to attend those and to make clear that this is an administration that is grossly out of step with where the populace is,
Yes.
even if they are claiming an unprecedented mandate to do all of these things.
Yeah, there was no mandate.
Right.
True.
Big mandate, big if true, but not. Okay, let's talk about Dobbs. It's been almost 3 years since Dobbs, and I guess as a starting point, can you walk us through the post-Dobbs landscape, and in particular, what you were hearing from Planned Parenthood patients and providers?
Yeah, you all are well up on the state of play, the 19 states that have total bans or very severe restrictions on access to abortion care. What we see, and hear every single day are about the barriers and the restrictions, many of which existed pre-Dobbs, right? Many of which existed even when we had a constitutional right to abortion, but the kinds of travel that people now have to engage in to get access to care, the increasing risk of criminality, right, of criminalization, because that as we know, they were never going to just stop at Dobbs. They were going to continue to like test the boundaries of federalism and test the boundaries of their ability to criminalize care. And, you know, whether they said they were going to stop at criminalizing patients or now criminalizing them from crossing state lines, right? You know, we are seeing that with this administration that, you know, took down the Justice Department fight against EMTALA, right? The willingness to go back to having to airlift patients in dire, emergent, potentially septic care to a neighboring state in order to get access to care. So we're just seeing kind of some of the most, you know, extreme horror stories for people who continue to travel. And again, this is, you know, 3 years past Dobbs and building on kind of what we have seen literally pre-Dobbs, but also really the intensity that happened during SB 8 and COVID. We are also seeing the criminalization of providers, right? You know, we've got a doctor here in New York State who is facing, you know, obviously Hochul will protect her, the governor will protect her, but extradition orders, you know, to Louisiana, lawsuits from Texas, which is also like completely insane. There's an impact too, just broadly about how OBGYNs and abortion providers are seeing this moment as well. Since Dobbs, we have seen, the first year after Dobbs, we saw a 10% decline of OBGYNs matching into banned states. That number went up to be 20% last year. And now we are seeing an overall decline of medical students choosing obstetrics and gynecology as their profession, right? So, you know, you think about communities where, you know, we already have a high degree of maternal mortality disparity among Black patients. You see higher infant mortality rather. We have seen an increase in sepsis cases in second trimester, 50% increase in second trimester sepsis cases in hospitals across the country, and or in banned states. And, you know, and at the same time, you know, no broad attention to the public health crisis that we are still in, right? And it's hard to keep track of, right? Because it's the constant chaos and confusion. It's the flood the zone approach. And so I think for everything that's happening kind of in the public health crisis standpoint, I'm also thinking about the patients who are coming to Planned Parenthood for sexual and reproductive health care, but they're also coming, you know, as who they are, right? So whether they're people of color more likely to be criminalized, whether they are undocumented and worried about keeping their appointments because they don't know whether or not ICE will show up, whether they are in increased fear because the Trump administration, in his their first weeks, he signed executive actions to let go, drop charges against folks who protest abortion clinics and that were charged under the FACE Act, or letting go of the January 6th protesters, many of whom Planned Parenthood was able to help identify because they are the same people who protest outside of our clinics. So the intersection of like kind of how this administration is operating, I know it's like a long-winded way of saying like, you know, it's all crazy.
Well, we didn't even talk about Pete Hegseth.
Oh, we didn't talk about, oh my gosh, my favorite weekend host on Fox News is now running the defense.
Hosts. Weekend hosts can be great people.
Weekend hosts rock. They are the most
really
brilliant
people.
Yes, exactly.
But he was an unusual choice. I mean, like for this administration that professed to be the protector of women, Pete Hegseth was an unusual choice to head a part of the government where women have increasingly been a part of the workforce, the military. And women have been really successful in the military in large part because the military has been one of the places where we've had this integration mandate, where we've had a lot of attention to questions of sexual assault. They have not been remedied entirely, but it's been a place where women can rise. And now we have someone who seems to believe that women shouldn't be in the military. Like, how do we connect this to sort of this broader landscape where we are questioning what women say, we are letting people who have swarmed and protest and done violent acts in front of clinics where women and other pregnant people are going for care? How do we square all of this with this promise to protect and uplift women?
I mean, how do we square it? It is, you know, first of all, I think they're moving to have policies actually align with where their actual agenda is. They're rolling back protections for those in the military to get access to abortion care out of, out of state or to travel off base to get access to care. They're rolling back kind of, protections for veterans. So in some ways, they're actually reverse, kind of squaring the policy to be more aligned with where they are. But what it does speak to me, and the question is, how are we squaring the fact that personnel is policy, right? And that the people who are now powering this administration, whether that's Pete Hegseth, whose own mama was like,
She tried to tell us.
she tried to tell us.
Until she recanted and tried to tell us something else.
But when your mama come for you, like that's a whole other, I'm just saying.
Black women knew. They did. They did. They did.
We knew. When you have Pam Bondi, right, who is an abortion rights activist as AG, when you have the architects of Project 2025, literally driving policy and strategy, we are whatever 50x days into our 4-year sentence, and they are 1/3 of the way through Project 2025. Okay, so the real question I have, like kind of going back to 2024, when we knew, obviously, the great majority of ballot initiatives that we were winning, we knew the great popularity that we saw around reproductive freedom and abortion rights, that it was going to continue to be a broad kind of, bipartisan, nonpartisan, kind of big tent issue that a lot of people would support. What we didn't kind of close the gap on was the disqualifying gap, right? Like we often talked about the believability gap during the Dobbs decision, that like only 30% of people actually believed that Roe would be overturned, which made it really hard to organize on before the memo leaked. I think in this election cycle, what we had was not a believability gap that people actually believed President Trump when he said that he was going to protect access to abortion care, but they just thought they kind of really disqualified all of his rhetoric because they're like, that's part of his showmanship, not part of what he will do. So I do think there is something about like our need to like just create a bunch of disqualifications around him and his administration that has led to a lot of folks not believing that the people who are now surrounding him, who are making the policy, are the ones driving the agenda, and that's where we need to close the gap.
So the ballot initiatives are actually a really fascinating kind of turn, right? So we saw immediately after Dobbs, voters in Kansas voting to continue preserving reproductive freedoms that had been put in place through a state high court decision there. And this happened like maybe 3 days after the Indiana state legislature enacted one of the most draconian bans in the country. And when asked about it, one of the things I noted was that's the difference between gerrymandering and not,
Yes.
right? So the Indiana state legislature is incredibly gerrymandered, and as a consequence, they don't need to be responsive to
Yes.
their constituents who may actually want reproductive freedom, even if they are Republican identified. When you allow the voters to go directly to the ballot box and register their preferences, you see what happened in Kansas. And I think that was galvanizing for the movement. And to be very clear, direct democracy mechanisms do not exist in every state, so this is not a panacea for what happened post-Dobbs, but it has been a glimmer of hope. But here's the problem, and you've identified it. We have an electorate that is, I think, woefully undereducated about how government works and may not understand that voting to preserve reproductive rights at the state level can be completely negated by then voting for someone at the federal level who is opposed to reproductive freedom. And this factors into your believability gap. This disparity can also be augmented by some sense that he doesn't really say what he means, or he's not going to do that. How do we wrestle now with sort of the closing avenues for preserving reproductive freedom? Direct democracy looked like something promising, but it has to be really closely mediated and mitigated. And we don't have a lot of avenues in the federal courts right now. So what's the path forward?
Right. So how do we get free again? Right.
Yeah.
Is that the question? Yes. Yeah. I mean, I actually think that I think what is so important about like how we saw direct democracy in action in 2024 and the ability of people like say in Arizona to split their freedom, right? To like vote to protect themselves in state while also voting, to potentially undo their own freedoms.
It was the eggs.
It was the eggs.
Like they didn't know that
there
your other
were
eggs are going to be harvested too. Right.
whose eggs are more important. Like literally, there were no eggs in my grocery store the other day. I was like, really no eggs, right? So I don't know what's happening with the eggs. But I'm going to answer the question on direct democracy.
Well, I think
because I don't have. I actually have a better path.
Flu might be part of this.
Yes,
but,
exactly. Well, but I'm
that's
saying
a different question.
That's a totally different question, and I think there is a better path. Like I think that part of how we got here, right, in this moment, and I think look, abortion rights were the canary in the coal mine, right? But the bigger story is the consolidation of power from minimum from 2010 to the present, right? The consolidation of the backlash against the Obama, presidency in the 2010 midterms, which captured a lot of state houses, which allowed for the gerrymandering with the Tea Party Congress, and then also the capture of the federal judiciary. That is to say, to paraphrase what you were saying, that we are operating in a structural disadvantage, a political structural disadvantage. And we are probably also operating in a, I would say, center-right ideology that is overlaying on that structure, as we see with all of these other kind of unleashing of anti-wokeness, DEI, fights. And, you can share how you think of how we should be talking about DEI in a second.
Dudes, ex-husbands, and incels.
And imbeciles.
Yeah.
But the idea, right, that we are locked in this structural disadvantage, and we still have some mechanisms. We have like 14 states that have now codified reproductive freedom, constitutional right to abortion in their state ballots, and there are probably another 5 or 6 on the horizon that where people are gathering signatures to continue to reinforce. We have to hold what we have. That is the first step. But we also have to think about this not just in electoral fights and ballot initiative fights, right? We have to build out a cycle that isn't, the midterms, the next presidential, the next, right? We have to have a path from 2020, well, last year I was saying from 24 to 2040 to think about how we actually get back into the Constitution and think about what is that road beyond Roe. So some of that is around maximizing the ballot initiatives that we have. Some of it is winning the governor's races where we are able to do that. Again, I'm still my Action Fund hat on. Winning the governor's races where we are able to protect those rights and also ensure that there are enough chambers that we can flip. So when we hit 2030, right, which will be another redistricting year, we have an opportunity to actually gain some ground back on the gerrymandering piece. I think we can get to, you need 38 states, obviously, to ratify a constitutional amendment. I do think that, I can kind of squint and see a path to maybe 32 by 2034. And thinking about the kind of transformative power that can be built, organizing around an issue that actually draws across party, that draws across gender, generation, race and class, is the moment that we have to be thinking about. It is about, I see honestly some of the Planned Parenthood organizing as like the big tent that the Democratic Party wishes it could be, because we see everybody, including the people who are protesting outside of the clinics. They may be standing out with the bullhorn one day, and then they may be walking in for birth control or an abortion the next day. So I think that there's an opportunity for us to bridge on this issue in a way that again helps us shore up and steel our democracy, and not having a kind of pro-reproductive freedom champion in the White House or in Congress in this moment doesn't mean that we have lost, right? It means that the movement has to do work to build and grow and amass power. So that's the only path forward, is to continue to like hold that kind of in the middle.
Let's talk a little bit about your work. So this is a conference about non-abortion care post-Dobbs. So we are thinking about cancer care, menopause care, IVF and fertility treatment. And these are all things that Planned Parenthood does, which many people may not know. So can you say more about the work that you're doing in these other spaces and how they may be impacted by the Dobbs decision or future decisions from this court that are coming down the pike?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, so first of all, as we said, that this was never just about abortion, right? This is about the Dobbs decision, all these fights about abortion are about power and control over reproduction. So Planned Parenthood affiliates see, patients for STI tests, they see them for wellness exams, they see them for birth control, they see them for obviously abortion care, gender affirming care. Planned Parenthood is the second largest provider of gender affirming care across the country. Menopause care, all of the ways in which I would say from 2 to 92. We need to be thinking about understanding our sexual and reproductive health care in our lives, right? And with the impact of the Dobbs decision, and now with the impact of actually this administration, any efforts to defund Planned Parenthood or defund Medicaid will have an impact on the ability of those services to, for patients to be seen using public health insurance. It means that the attacks on watching the attacks that we are seeing, particularly around gender affirming care and support for minors, where you have public institutions, celebrated, storied institutions, hospital systems no longer providing gender affirming care for minors. We're seeing them retreat while Planned Parenthood continues to stand in the breach and support people who need strong access to care. Anytime sexual and reproductive health care is front page and under attack, that there will be greater stigma, there will be it will unleash more protesters, it will kind of bring more back at the very people who are providing the care and the patients who are seeking it. And so, I think we have to look at the impact with all of the ways in which people themselves are under attack and how they are being limited to get access to care.
How are you all being targeted as you stand in the breach in these places where you're providing care that may not necessarily be aligned with this administration's priorities?
Well, we are under attack with the administration. It's not a full frontal assault, I would say, at this moment.
They actually haven't said a lot about abortion or Planned Parenthood, but it's only been 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Were you expecting to get a pass?
No, I think because abortion's more popular than Donald Trump. So, and more popular than any other elected. Planned Parenthood is more popular than Donald Trump or any other elected. And so it doesn't make political sense to come after us kind of with a full frontal assault. So they will find backdoor mechanisms, right? So obviously they haven't gotten to the whatever, page in Project 2025 as they're going through their list, because clearly they're checking those boxes.
It's in page 700, HHS.
Yes, okay, it's 700 HHS. So they have a little ways. We're 2/3 in. So in 2/3 time, we will see those attacks, whether that is the Comstock, the attacks on medication abortion through Comstock, or the current attack, like I said, which is defunding Medicaid, which is implicitly, obviously, trying to defund Planned Parenthood. We are seeing it in the court system, right? There is a Supreme Court case that's going to be heard on April 2nd. That is about whether or not South Carolina can kick the affiliate Planned Parenthood South Atlantic out of its Medicaid program, as a way of denying people the dignity of choosing their own provider, and as a way of creating some precedent for other states to just kick Planned Parenthood as a provider out of Medicaid. So we'll see these kinds of things ripple across. As we know, the great laboratory across the South and many of these state houses is to really start to push the boundaries on where they can go and to get favorable courts to allow them to enforce denials of freedom under the Constitution. So they have a fast track through the court. Planned Parenthood and our 3 Texas affiliates, Planned Parenthood Federation of America, and our 3 affiliates are also in a lawsuit in the Fifth Circuit in Texas, right in Amarillo, with our
Judge Matthew Kacsmaryk, America's favorite district court judge and chief scientist.
Yes. Okay, I missed the science degree.
So did he.
Where obviously we are fighting, fighting a just meritless case around false claims, where they've used doctored videos to kick us out of care, and a lot of misinformation, and we're fighting our way through the Fifth Circuit, and
Well, you won in a 3-judge panel at the Fifth Circuit, but now the Fifth Circuit has agreed to take the case up en banc, which means all of the judges.
All of the judges will, exactly. So yes, I mean, and I think that's actually the lesson here. Your cause for maybe questioning or being a little wary around what a federal strategy is here, because even though we won in the ballot initiative in Missouri, which was an incredible win, right? It was the first state to actually flip a ban. We only were able to start providing in the last month, because we still had to go to court to, take away all the draconian restrictions to ensure and to shore up the attorney general there, to ensure that we could actually get the care that we need, not the attorney general, but the judge there, to ensure that that we could provide without consequence. And so every time we win, like, it's a little AI, right? Every time we win, there is a muscle that's learning on the other side on how to push back, right? Every time we win, like we won in Wisconsin, that state Supreme Court seat, which was an incredibly expensive seat, in order to ensure not just protecting access to abortion, but also protecting access to democracy through redistricting. We now have another seat coming up that will be even more expensive, because Elon Musk is spending into it.
Right.
And people
this is
understand
the
those
race
things.
between Brad Schmel
State
and
Supreme Court,
the state Supreme Court, between Brad Schmel and Susan Crawford. Susan Crawford is the Democratic affiliated candidate, and Elon Musk has donated, I believe, $1.5 million to her challenger, Brad Schmel, who was the former Attorney General of Wisconsin and who essentially enforced really draconian laws.
Yeah. So even though you win, right? Even though we win, right? We can't be staid about winning, right? Winning requires defending too, and that is a part of, like, building into the movement work the notion that providing care requires defending the care as well.
And that election is in April, so it's coming up really soon, and this is a great place for people to put their activist energies. If they have anything left in the tank, this is a great place to do it.
Yeah, but like I said, I think it's a little bit of, like, like I said, maybe it's an extra hour of daylight, maybe it's an extra, like the new resistance on the horizon, but people are kind of coming out and into the, back into the space. I think we all needed some time to just breathe at the end of last year.
How does your work in the healthcare space, providing this essential care to a wide range of people, how does that fuel and shape the nature of your advocacy?
Look, I think that, first of all, patients come to Planned Parenthood health centers for some of the most important, intimate, care that they will receive in their lives. Planned Parenthood health centers are oftentimes the first point of entry into the healthcare system. And one other data point: 1 out of 3 women has been to a Planned Parenthood in their lifetime. So just to consider the vast majority, whether it's like 2 million patients a year, but think about over successive years, how many people have had a touch point with a Planned Parenthood health center. And what that means is that Planned Parenthood has become synonymous with being a very trusted provider, right? One that provides non-judgmental care, high quality service, and being there when people need them. The same people who have experienced care at a Planned Parenthood health center are also the same people who want to fight and defend the care. I often kind of describe my job as a little bit of a hope dealer, but like a little bit of a, I know maybe we'll talk about hope at the end, but like a little bit of like a story keeper as well. Oftentimes when people ask me what I do, or, I'm out somewhere, first thing that people do is tell me their story, no matter where I am. And, it often, sometimes it's an actual story, all of their details. Sometimes it's just a look in the eye of, like, thank you. Sometimes it's like a squeeze, hand of, like, thank you so much for being here. Like, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for that fight. Because they know what it has meant for them, for somebody in their lives, for somebody in their families. And they know, like, just that squeeze, to be honest, continues to tell me how many people are out there, whether they're quiet or vocal, ready to fight and defend the care. And so I think that, Planned Parenthood through our, vast federation, 49 affiliates across the country, 600 health centers, the largest provider of sexual and reproductive health care, the care is essential to, supporting and creating healthy communities. But healthcare is politicized. Sexual and reproductive health care is politicized. And without the defense of that care and the advocacy to protect it and to continue to fight back, we would not be able to offer the care that we do. So, I think that the same people who are out there getting the care eventually become the same people who are out there defending the care, and that advocacy piece is why a Planned Parenthood would actually be under attack, right? Because the majority of people support care, but what elected sphere is the power that Planned Parenthood has built over the years for defending and fighting that care.
So this is a full frontal attack on a lot of aspects of knowledge generation. I think it's really important for people to understand that some of the roots of Planned Parenthood were in this fight in the 1920s and 1930s over access to knowledge. Like Margaret Sanger was criminally indicted for distributing information about contraception. Right now, this administration is engaged in a full-on attack on knowledge production, largely at universities, but not exclusively. And one of the things that they have done in just a short period of time is limit, restrict, and defund health research. Yes. And you all do some health research, certainly not on the scale of large universities or medical centers, but you do it. Are you and other groups who are doing this research prepared and equipped to step into the breach now as universities and health centers that have traditionally done this kind of work are being limited in their ability to do
I'm
so?
so glad you asked that question. Like, yes. I think that's actually the vision of where we want to go, right? And I say that as a researcher, because it's not just the defunding of universities to do this work. It is not just the defunding of it's been the state level defunding, disbanding of maternal morbidity committees, the ways in which they have, because they want to hide the damage, right, the collateral damage, they're no longer counting, right, the impact of what has happened because of the Dobbs decision. And so it is ever more important when we watch what's happening to NIH, when we watch what's happening to universities. I think about in the backdrop of that, the power of Planned Parenthood is the breadth of our infrastructure, right? It is the breadth of our ability to create, I think, the nation's largest sexual and reproductive health care index. So if they're going to disband the Minority Social Vulnerability Index, like we can step into the breach and actually create the index that allows us to understand, iterate, and innovate on care. So when I came into Planned Parenthood 6 years ago, and even before as a board leader, one of the things that we knew about our own internal data was, not surprisingly, given this is an experience across kind of health inequity broadly, was that our patients of color, and specifically Black patients, were not having the same experiences as our white patients, right? We didn't have anybody who was waking up every single day thinking about what are we doing about that, right? Just accepting it as a fact of the broader health equity, in our culture and society. And we have invested a significant amount of resources, a significant grant that we received from McKinsey Scott into a Black Health Equity Initiative with the question of what would it take for Planned Parenthood to become the premier destination for Black women and femmes and gender-expansive people to get their care? And what evidence base would we need to be able to say and defend that claim? And how we build that infrastructure and do our own internal research, because we actually have the capacity to set controls and rigor in the work that we understand. And that is just an incredible, for all of the fight back, the fight forward is that, right? The fight forward is continuing to ground ourselves in community, to continuing to build a, kind of an intersectional frame for addressing and driving kind of health equity in a way that centers the experience of those who've been most harmed and experiencing the greatest barriers, but also creating the opportunity for us to be a leader in driving those interventions. So that research, I think, absolutely is a place where we will be building into the gap, into the breach, because, we have to sustain something out of the rubble, right? I keep thinking like this administration is just like, DOGE is just like, burn, and I forgot even to mention the DOGE attack. Elon Musk wrote an op-ed about defunding Planned Parenthood and Elmo, in the Wall Street Journal. So in all kinds of ways, they're going to be trying to come for the work, and in the middle of the rubble, we're going to have to rebuild.
Can I ask you a more personal question?
Sure.
So you've been in this role, I think, is it 4 years or 5 years?
2019.
Okay, all right. So just before the pandemic, you stepped in. You had been a member of the Planned Parenthood board, and then you stepped in to lead the organization. I think a lot of Black women are familiar with coming into leadership or assuming leadership roles at times when an organization is on the precipice of something big, maybe even something dangerous. I think people call it a glass cliff. So you assumed the reins of Planned Parenthood as we knew the fight for Roe was building and would ultimately culminate with a decision at the Supreme Court that likely would topple Roe. How do you deal with standing on the glass cliff, standing on the precipice, knowing that you've taken the reins of an organization at literally the most critical and difficult and challenging time when everyone else had a rough road, but maybe not quite as rough as this? But here you are, a Black woman, and you're not the first Black woman to lead Planned Parenthood, but you are the first Black woman to take it on in the middle of what is a full frontal attack.
Okay, Melissa.
See, weekend hosts can bring it sometimes.
We can, you know what? In the next administration, I'm going to nominate you to be defense secretary, right?
Ready to serve.
Ready to,
Okay.
You have all of the qualifications.
Yes.
And I bet your mama would approve, right?
She would. She'd write a good letter.
She would write a good letter for
She
you.
would.
Here's the thing. My dear friend, mentor, and sister, Cecile Richards, who passed away actually on the same day as Inauguration Day and MLK Day, which, she had a way of coming into a room, she had a way of exiting, and when she stepped down, a number of people came to me and asked me, was I going to put my, presuming I would be interested in putting my name in, and I remember saying, oh no, I know what that job is. I want 8 parts of that work, but also with the kind of a real underpinning. And I remember having a conversation with a board member at the time that we knew probably longer before many other people knew. It may not have been the Dobbs case. There were 18 other cases that were winding their way through the court system that Roe would be overturned in the coming. We were preparing for it and all of that, but I said exactly what you articulated. I said, Planned Parenthood, this committee is going to turn this over to a woman of color, maybe a Black woman, and they are going to preside over the end of Roe, right? And that sat with me, and there was something I couldn't see in it, something I didn't want to hold in that. Like, why is that our responsibility to carry? The reality is the boards had to make a quick decision, and I was, able to step in a very moment. But I also my famous last words to the board were, this 2019 in July, and I said, "I'll just get you through 2020." The reality, though, is kind of sometimes when you are put into these positions, is that you actually don't have the time and the luxury to plan, to think, right? You are walking into a burning building, and your job is to actually just, put the fire out and get things done, right? And so it's about putting one foot in front of the other. And as Dobbs was approaching through SB, and we all pretty much knew when the Supreme Court declined to intervene in SB 8 that Dobbs was well on its way to overturning Roe, that not only was I going to be the presiding over the end of Roe, but I was also going to be the leader to ask the question, who are we going to be when we're no longer defending Roe? Who are we going to be when we have the opportunity to rebuild and reimagine an organization and in a movement that was never built and designed to include us and to include me, right? And so, there is something about that I think really kind of moved me in a way as I was taking it on, or someplace that I kept coming back to. And then I remembered, I also had a conversation with affiliate CEO who kind of was watching me in the beginning when I just had stepped in as an interim. And she said, like, doing a great job, thank you so much for doing this. I just have one note for you, right? Which is that you feel tentative in your leadership. You feel like, I described it as I'm doing the work, the caretaking to create the space for the next leader. And, I describe it as, going to somebody's house and they've really beautiful appointed guest room. And, you want to put the pillows back exactly where you found them. And you want to make sure that the bathroom looks, fantastic. And, almost like you want to make it seem like you were never there. And she said, what I want you to do is think about just driving it like you stole it. And that became my mantra. And so whatever the circumstances, because I'm clear that we don't get these positions, particularly as Black women or women of color, until it's falling apart. In the same way Barack Obama didn't get elected until, the world was falling apart.
Was that falling apart?
Oh, yeah, true.
Wow.
It was then.
Okay, clear.
It was a different standard, right? We have a different standard. But sometimes when you were in these positions, when they were, again, created to allow us in but not really include us, you have the opportunity to remake them while you're in.
What gives you hope in this moment? What's your hopium? You hope dealer?
Oh my God, my hopium. I love this one with her turn of phrase. My hopium. I have to say, honestly, it is the Planned Parenthood providers. It's the people who work in the Planned Parenthood health centers. It is my affiliate colleagues who show up every single day to meet the need. I've been talking a lot about, hope is people think of hope as this beautiful, kind, joyous feeling, right? But hope is really hard, right? It's it's an act of resistance. It's it's kind of doing a dance, right? It's saying that if you stay with me and continue to fight with me, you can get what's on the other side, but you got to get through the fight first. And so I think that hope actually needs an infrastructure, right? And that infrastructure are the people who are showing up every day, who are opening up the doors. It's the infrastructure of the litigators who are suing the hell out of all these freedom deniers. It's the folks who are fundraising. It's the folks who are walking people through protesters. It's the, young activists. I mean, I spoke to a high school in the city this morning of young people who are dying to find their way to get involved in movement. There's so much energy that is hopeful out there. And I think and believe that is actually, obviously so essential right now. But I also think about the hope of the person who is getting in the car and driving 18 hours from Texas to Colorado, right? That person is getting in a car. They probably just left a shift. They have, I don't know, maybe 36 hours to get back. They've had to figure out childcare. They've had to figure out how they're going to take time off. They've had to get the money up, and they are on that road with a laser focused hope, right? That when they get there, somebody's going to be there to take care of them. And to me, that means that hopelessness is actually a luxury, right? That we can be all demoralized. I mean, and we have every reason to be demoralized. We have every reason to feel hopeless about the state of our democracy and the state of our whatever, what the fuck, right? All of it. And at the same time, there are people who are depending that we are holding on to hope for it, because if we're not holding on to it, then they can't hold on to it. And that can't be the world that we live in either. So it's not a person, right? It's really the infrastructure that I think we need for all of the work that we do to drive hope.
Please join me in thanking Alexis McGill Johnson.